In the autumn of 1969, four British friends pooled what money they had and decided to build a Formula One car from nothing. They gave themselves 12 weeks. They had no factory history, no famous name, and most of the paddock thought they were a joke. Then their car rolled out for its very first race, and it outqualified Ferrari, Lotus, Brabham, and everyone else on the grid. This is the story of the March 701, and the four men who beat the giants of motorsport in roughly 90 days. To understand how absurd this was, you have to understand who these people were. They were not a car company. They were not backed by an oil giant or a national government. They were four men who liked racing and believed, with very little evidence, that they could do it better than everyone else. The first was Robin Herd, a gifted young engineer who had already designed race-winning cars for McLaren and was regarded as one of the brightest technical minds in Britain. The second was Max Mosley, a barrister and amateur racer with a sharp commercial brain, the man who would one day run the entire sport as president of the governing body. The third was Alan Rees, a former driver who knew how to run a race team from the inside. And the fourth was Graham Coker, an engineer and businessman who understood how to actually build things in a workshop and turn them out fast. Four men with four very different skills: the commercial brain, the designer, the team manager, and the builder who could turn drawings into metal. And when they sat down at the end of 1969 to name their new company, they did the simplest thing imaginable. They took the first letters of their surnames: Mosley, Alan Rees, Coker, Herd, M-A-R-C-H, March. Here is the part that should not have worked. They did not have a grand plan to build one beautiful car and chase glory. Herd later admitted the 701 was essentially a good 1969 design rather than anything groundbreaking, and that it was thrown together very quickly because it had to be. Their real idea was about business, not romance. They wanted to be to racing chassis what Cosworth was to engines, the supplier everyone came to, the garage that would sell a competitive car to anybody with the money to buy one. So they set up shop in a modest factory in Bicester or Bicester in Oxfordshire, and they got to work. And the deadline they were staring at was genuinely insane. To enter the 1970 World Championship, they needed a finished race-ready Formula One car on the grid in South Africa in early March. Counting backwards from a standing start at the end of 1969, that gave them around 12 weeks to design, build, and test a Grand Prix machine. 12 weeks! To put that in perspective, established teams spent the better part of a year developing a new car. Ferrari had decades of accumulated knowledge, their own engine foundry, and a workforce of hundreds. March had four founders, a handful of mechanics, a rented building, and a calendar that was already working against them. So Herd kept the design honest and simple. The 701 was built around a basic bathtub monocoque, a strong aluminium tub with conventional suspension hanging off it, nothing exotic, nothing that needed half a year of testing just to understand. There was one quietly clever touch. The car wore distinctive wing-shaped tanks on each side of the body, an early attempt to use the car's own bodywork to manage the air flowing past it, a line of thinking the sport would chase far harder in the years that followed. But mostly the 701 was about getting a sound, dependable car finished on time. And against every reasonable expectation, finished it was. But this is where the youngest, most ambitious move of the whole story comes in. Before they had built a single Formula One car, before anyone had seen the thing run, March pulled off the kind of deal that should have been impossible. They convinced the reigning world champion to drive for them. Britain's reigning world champion Jackie Stewart had won the 1969 title with Matra. For 1970, his team owner Ken Tyrrell needed a car, and rather than build his own straight away, Tyrrell decided to buy customer chassis. He bought them from March. That meant that this brand new company, which had existed for a matter of weeks, was suddenly going to put the best driver in the world in one of its cars. That single arrangement transformed March from a hopeful little startup into a genuine threat overnight. And then the orders kept coming, because the business model was working before the car had even turned a wheel. The works team would run 2 cars, one for Chris Amon, who had just walked away from Ferrari to lead this brand new outfit, and one for the Swiss driver Joe Siffert, whose seat was effectively paid for by Porsche to the tune of £30,000, purely to stop a rival team from signing him. Stop and take in that irony. The man who had left Ferrari was now the spearhead of the company, about to humiliate it. Tyrrell would run 2 more cars for Stewart and his teammate, and the American entrant Andy Granatelli ordered yet another for Mario Andretti. By the time the first race arrived, March had not built one Formula One car. They had built 5. Now think about what that meant. A company that did not exist a few months earlier was about to fill almost a third of the grid at the season opener. Nobody in the history of the sport had ever announced themselves like this. The question was whether the cars would actually be any good, or whether March had simply found a very fast way to embarrass themselves in front of the entire racing world. The answer came at Kyalami, the circuit just outside Johannesburg, on the 7th of March 1970. When qualifying ended, the timing sheets told a story nobody was ready for. On pole position, fastest of everyone, sat a March 701. Jackie Stewart had put the car on top. Alongside him on the front row sat another March, Chris Amon in the works car, equal on time. 2 cars from a team that was 12 weeks old, locking out the front row of a World Championship Grand Prix. And behind them sat the entire establishment of the sport. Jack Brabham was there in his own car. Jochen Rindt lined up further back in the new Lotus, and the brand new flat 12 Ferrari of Jackie Ickx, the single most anticipated machine of the season, the car Enzo Ferrari had pinned his hopes on, languished down in 5th. The oldest and most decorated name in Italian motor racing had been beaten to pole by a British team assembled in a shed in Oxfordshire over the winter. Consider what that actually meant for a second. Ferrari had been building and racing Grand Prix cars since before most of the March founders were born. Enzo Ferrari had just handed control of his road car business to Fiat, so he could focus everything on racing. And his shiny new flat 12 had been out-qualified on a brand new constructor's very first attempt by 4 friends and a calendar. The race itself was harder. Stewart led the opening 19 laps, looking every bit the champion, before the more developed Brabham and McLaren came through. The March was fast, but it was also heavy and unproven, and Stewart eventually brought it home in 3rd. A podium finish on debut for a team nobody had taken seriously a few months earlier. If that had been the whole story, it would already be remarkable. But March were not finished. They were just getting warmed up. 2 weeks later, the teams gathered at Brands Hatch in England for the Race of Champions, a non-championship event that still drew the full Formula One field. Stewart took pole again in the March 701, and this time he did not let it slip. He led, he controlled it, and he won, beating Rindt and Denny Hume. The 4 friends had their first victory, and the car that was supposed to be a quick and dirty stopgap was now winning races against the best drivers alive. Then came Spain, and the win that would put the March 701 into the record books forever. The Spanish Grand Prix was held at Jarama, the tight little circuit north of Madrid, on the 19th of April. This one was a championship round, with real points on the line. And Stewart's Tyrrell entered March was not even an official works car. It was a customer chassis, bought from March by a privateer team, the kind of underdog setup that simply did not win Grand Prix anymore. The start was chaos. On the opening lap, Jackie Oliver's BRM suffered a suspension failure and speared straight into Ickx's Ferrari. Both cars erupted into flames. Both drivers were dragged clear, Ickx with burns lucky to be alive. The single Ferrari in the field was a charred wreck at the side of the track before the race had properly begun, and the fire would go on to force real safety reforms in the sport. Stewart, meanwhile, simply drove away from everyone. He led from the front, he never looked troubled, and he took the checkered flag for March's first ever World Championship victory in only the team's second championship race. Bruce McLaren came home second. Mario Andretti, in yet another March 701, finished third. And here is the detail that still gives that result its weight. It was the last time in Formula One history that a customer car won a World Championship Grand Prix. A car bought off the shelf, run by a small independent team, beating the factory giants at their own game. After Jarama, the sport changed in ways that made that kind of victory impossible ever again. The March 701 closed a door behind it. To complete the run, the Works team then won the International Trophy on home soil at Silverstone, a week after Spain, with Chris Emmon taking the victory and Stewart second. And it very nearly got better still. At Monaco a few weeks later, Stewart and the March were quick once again, and he led the race convincingly, looking for all the world like the likely winner, before a problem dropped him out of contention. The car was not winning on luck. It was genuinely, repeatedly, frighteningly fast. So in the space of a few short weeks, the cars from that 12-week-old company had won 3 Formula One races in a row, sat on a string of pole positions, and made the most storied team in the sport look ordinary. 4 friends, almost no money, a few months of work, and they were beating Ferrari, the pride of Italian motor racing. Quick note before we get to how it all came apart. If you are enjoying this one, take a second to subscribe to the channel. I go through the comments on every single video, so if there is a car or a team or a forgotten underdog you want to see covered next, tell me down there and I will read it. Now, back to 1970 and the cracks that were already starting to show. Because for all the early magic, the March 701 had a problem, and it was a problem the founders had built into the car on purpose. The 701 was heavy. It weighed around 70 kilograms, roughly 150 pounds, over the minimum weight limit. In a sport where engineers fight for every ounce, that is an enormous amount of extra mass to drag around a circuit, and it was not an accident. Hurd had deliberately built the car strong, simple, and reliable. Partly because a customer car has to survive in the hands of dozens of different teams, and partly because Tyrrell and Stewart themselves had pushed for safety and dependability over fragile speed. That decision is exactly why the car was good enough to win early, when rivals were still sorting out their new designs. But it is also why the car faded. While March had been racing flat out from day one, the competition had been quietly building something better. The biggest threat came from Lotus. Colin Chapman unveiled the Lotus 72, a radical wedge-shaped machine with a completely different approach to weight, cooling, and aerodynamics. Next to it, the honest, heavy, conventional March 701 suddenly looked like exactly what it was. A very good 1969 car racing in 1970. Ferrari too finally got their flat 12 working properly, and by the second half of the season, Ickx and Clay Regazzoni were winning races and chasing the title. This is the cruel arithmetic of motor racing. A car that is brilliant in March can be ordinary by July, not because it got slower, but because everyone else got faster. March had thrown their car together in 12 weeks and raced it flat out from the very first weekend. Their rivals had spent that same spring quietly refining machines that were simply more advanced. The early shock of the 701 had come from catching everyone cold. Once the field warmed up, the extra weight and the conventional design had nowhere left to hide. Stewart felt it immediately. He has been blunt about the car ever since. He said the March was not a bad design, but it was not a good car either. It was reasonably competitive, but never friendly to drive, and the cars simply were not built as well as they needed to be. For a perfectionist like Stewart, who measured everything in tenths and trust, a car he could not lean on completely was a car that was always going to let him down eventually. And it did. As the season wore on, the early wins dried up. The March 701 that had stunned everyone in March and April was being left behind by July and August. Ken Tyrrell, watching his world champion struggle in a customer car he did not control, made a decision that quietly signaled the end of the honeymoon. He started building his own car in secret. The Tyrrell 001 appeared late in the season, and Stewart put it on pole on its very first outing. The message was clear. Tyrrell no longer wanted to win in someone else's machine. Stewart finished the 1970 championship in 5th place, with that single Spanish victory and a scattering of podiums. For the reigning world champion, it was a disappointing title defense. The car that had announced itself so violently in the spring had not been able to sustain it through the summer and autumn. But the story of the four friends did not end with the car going off the boil. In some ways, the hardest part was still to come, and it had nothing to do with lap times. The team that had been built on friendship began to come apart under the ordinary pressures of money and ambition. Running a Formula One Works team and a customer car business at the same time is brutally expensive, and the cash was always tight. The four had different ideas about where the company should go and how much risk it should carry, and the strain of keeping everything running started to wear the partnership down. Graham Coker, the man who had made the factory actually produce cars, left the company in early 1971, and then, just months later, tragedy struck. Coker was badly injured in a racing accident and died in May of 1971, still only in his late 30s. One of the four names in March was gone in the cruelest way the sport can take someone. Alan Rees left as well, worn down by the financial pressure of keeping the operation alive. Within roughly 3 years of founding the company, only 2 of the original 4 remained: Mosley and Hurd. The friendship that had built a Formula One car in 12 weeks could not survive everything that came after it. And yet, look at what those 4 men actually set in motion. March did not win a world championship. The Works Formula One team only ever scored a small handful of Grand Prix victories, and the founder's own Works effort was wound down before the decade was out. By the raw measure of titles, you could call March a failure. But that measure misses the point entirely, because the real triumph of March was the business those 4 friends had bet everything on. They became one of the most prolific manufacturers of customer racing cars in the world. March Chassis won championships in Formula 2, in Formula 3, in Formula Atlantic, and in category after category below the top level. March cars crossed the Atlantic and conquered American racing too, winning the Indianapolis 500, the biggest race on that side of the world, 5 years in a row through the 1980s. They built sports prototypes and endurance machines. For an entire generation of drivers climbing the ladder toward Formula One, the road to the top ran through a march. Ronnie Peterson, one of the fastest men of the era, made his name in their cars, and in the very next season, he dragged the march that followed the 701 to second place in the World Championship. The little company that was supposed to flame out in a single embarrassing season instead became a fixture of motorsport for the better part of 3 decades. And the founders themselves went on to extraordinary things. Robin Herd kept designing race cars for years and remained one of the most respected engineers in the business. Max Mosley left the workshop behind, threw himself into the politics and the commercial machinery of the sport, helped rewrite how Formula One was run and sold to the world, and eventually rose to become president of the FIA, the governing body of the entire sport. The barrister who once took the first letter of his surname and dropped it into the middle of a company name ended up running the whole show. So when you hear the story as a single line, 4 friends built an F1 car in 90 days and beat Ferrari, it sounds like a tall tale, the kind of thing that gets exaggerated with every retelling. But it is not exaggerated. It is, if anything, undersold. Because they did not just beat Ferrari once with a lucky result. For a few glorious weeks in the spring of 1970, a company that had existed for a matter of months put its cars on pole, won 3 races in a row, and stood at the very front of the most competitive sport on Earth, ahead of teams with decades of history and budgets they could only dream of. The March 701 was not the best car of 1970. It was too heavy, it faded, and the man driving it never truly loved it. But it might be the greatest British startup story Formula One has ever seen. 4 friends, a shed in Oxfordshire, 12 weeks, and the audacity to believe they belonged on the same grid as Ferrari. They did not just believe it. For one unforgettable spring, they proved it. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe and stick around. There are more forgotten underdog stories from the golden age of motorsport already in the works, and I would love to have you here for the next one.